for a while, nothing changes. The open air continues to move in and out of the room, unremarkable, as if it has already passed through many times tonight. Then, from farther away than before, a sound gathers. It doesn't arrive suddenly. It approaches in pieces, low and stretched thin, barely noticeable at first. A vehicle moves along a larger road somewhere beyond the buildings, not close enough to demand attention, not distant enough to disappear completely. The sound rises slightly as it passes through an open stretch. There's a moment where it seems as though it might continue, or multiply, or draw other sounds with it. It doesn't. Instead, it fades in the same direction it came from, losing its shape first, then its volume, until it becomes indistinguishable from the background it emerged from. Nothing follows it. The space it leaves behind feels wider than before, as if the room had been holding its breath without realizing it. The balcony light remains on. The door stays open. The air keeps moving. But something has shifted. The outside world has finished speaking for the night. Not formally, not with any sense of conclusion. It simply stops offering new information. The city no longer sends signals inward. It settles into distance, present but uninterested. Inside the apartment, nothing reacts to the absence. No object changes position. No sound fills the gap. The quiet that remains isn't new. It was already there, waiting for that last movement to pass through so it could take up more space. The air feels colder now, or perhaps more noticeable without the interruption. The open balcony no longer feels like an opening. It feels like a boundary that has already been agreed upon between what still moves and what no longer needs to. Whatever might have happened elsewhere tonight has already happened. Here, there is nothing left to arrive. The room has settled into itself, not in a dramatic way, more like something that has decided it doesn't need to adjust anymore. The chair near the door remains slightly angled, not pushed in, not pulled out far enough to matter. It holds the shape of how someone stood up earlier, paused, and then chose not to move it back. A jacket hangs there now, one sleeve folded inward, the other slipping closer to the floor. The fabric carries the temperature from outside, cooler than the room, as if it arrived late. Nothing else acknowledges it. The table holds a few objects, spread without intention. Keys placed down without sound. A phone turned face down, screen dark. edges worn smooth from use. There's a faint ring on the surface of the table, left by a cup that hasn't been there for hours. The mark stayed. No one thought to wipe it away. The floor near the balcony door is colder. Barely. Enough that it registers when weight shifts, then disappears once the feet are still again. Air moves through the apartment slowly, not as a draft, more like a shared decision between inside and outside. The balcony light remains on, casting its shape inward now, touching the edge of the room. It stops short of the far wall, leaving part of the space unchanged. The city doesn't interrupt. Its sounds arrive one at a time. A distant door, something metallic, then nothing again. There's no effort to listen closely. The sounds don't ask for attention. They pass through the room the way light does, without staying long enough to be named. The air feels colder than it did yesterday. Not uncomfortable, just noticeable along the hands, where skin is uncovered. The room doesn't respond. It doesn't tighten or retreat. It stays exactly as it was before the temperature changed. Time isn't moving forward in any obvious way. It's collecting instead, gathering in corners, along the edges of furniture, in the space between objects that were placed down and never returned to. This is not a moment waiting to become something else. It is simply where the evening stopped. Some things were placed down earlier, with the expectation that they would be picked up again. They weren't. The keys rest near the edge of the table, closer to falling than to being organized. They make no sound now. Their weight is already known to the surface beneath them. The phone stays face down. Not deliberately, just turned that way, without thought. Its screen hasn't lit up in a while, and no one checks to see if it will. A notebook sits half open, one page folded slightly at the corner, as if marked without intention. The writing inside doesn't continue past a certain point. It simply stops. Nothing suggests it needs to be finished. A cup remains on the counter, empty except for a faint trace at the bottom. Whatever warmth it once held has long since left. Only the shape remains. The light from the balcony reaches it briefly, then moves on as the air shifts. Nearby, a window reflects part of the room back at itself. Not clearly, just enough to double the outlines. Furniture appears once more, slightly offset, as if the room is checking its own position. The floor carries subtle differences in temperature. Near the walls, it feels more settled. near the door, it hasn't decided yet. The air continues to move through, slow and unhurried. It touches the edges of objects first, then passes between them without disturbing their arrangement. There's a sense that these things have already done what was asked of them today. They don't anticipate what comes next. They don't prepare. They remain because remaining is simpler than being put away. The apartment doesn't feel unfinished. It feels paused, as if everything that matters has already arrived, and nothing new is expected to enter the room tonight. The balcony door remains open at the same angle it has held for a while. No one adjusts it. The air seems to understand the size of the opening and works within it. Cold moves in quietly. Not as a rush. Not enough to change the room all at once. It arrives in layers, settling first near the floor, then along the edges of furniture. The metal railing outside holds the temperature longer. It doesn't warm quickly. It doesn't try to. The light above the balcony stays on, unchanged, as if it has accepted its role for the night. It doesn't brighten or dim. It simply continues. Beyond the railing, the open space doesn't offer detail, just depth. Distance without shape. Wind passes through the gap and leaves again, then returns. Each time slightly different, as if it hasn't decided on a pattern. Inside, the room gives it room. Curtains shift once, just enough to register movement, then rest again. They don't repeat it. The colder air makes certain surfaces more aware of themselves. Skin notices where fabric ends. Hands feel the difference between resting and moving. Nothing reacts quickly. The apartment absorbs the change the way it has absorbed many others before. The outside air carries no message. It doesn't bring sound with it. It doesn't take anything away. It only confirms that the space beyond the balcony is larger than the room, and unconcerned with what happens inside it. The city remains present, but distant enough to feel optional. Its noise no longer presses in. It waits at the edges. The night feels colder than expected for this time of year. Not sharply so. Just enough to suggest that the season has shifted slightly ahead of schedule. The room doesn't comment on that. It holds its shape. The furniture stays where it was. The light remains on. The door stays open. This is not exposure. It's an agreement between inside and outside, between warmth and cold, between what stays and what passes through. For now, everything holds. For a while, nothing changes. The open air continues to move in and out of the room, unremarkable, as if it has already passed through many times tonight. Then, from farther away than before, a sound gathers. It doesn't arrive suddenly. It approaches in pieces, low and stretched thin, barely noticeable at first. A vehicle moves along a larger road somewhere beyond the buildings, not close enough to demand attention, not distant enough to disappear completely. The sound rises slightly as it passes through an open stretch. There's a moment where it seems as though it might continue, or multiply, or draw other sounds with it. It doesn't. Instead, it fades in the same direction it came from, losing its shape first, then its volume, until it becomes indistinguishable from the background it emerged from. Nothing follows it. The space it leaves behind feels wider than before, as if the room had been holding its breath without realizing it. The balcony light remains on. The door stays open. The air keeps moving. But something has shifted. The outside world has finished speaking for the night. Not formally, not with any sense of conclusion. It simply stops offering new information. The city no longer sends signals inward. It settles into distance, present, but uninterested. Inside the apartment, nothing reacts to the absence. No object changes position. No sound fills the gap. The quiet that remains isn't new. It was already there, waiting for that last movement to pass through so it could take up more space. The air feels colder now, or perhaps more noticeable without the interruption. The open balcony no longer feels like an opening. It feels like a boundary that has already been agreed upon between what still moves and what no longer needs to. Whatever might have happened elsewhere tonight has already happened. Here, there is nothing left to arrive. After that last sound fades, the night does not replace it with anything. There is no follow-up, no distant echo, no secondary movement waiting its turn. The air continues to pass through the open door, but now it does so without interruption, as if the space outside has finally cleared. Inside, the apartment remains unchanged. The chair holds its angle. The jacket keeps its shape. The table keeps its quiet arrangement without asking for adjustment. The balcony light stays on, steady and indifferent. It no longer feels temporary. The room does not expect it to be turned off. The city has shifted into something less descriptive. It exists more as a condition than a collection of sounds. Whatever movement remains out there no longer reaches this space. The open air feels wider now, not colder exactly, just less occupied. The difference is subtle, but noticeable in the way nothing competes with it anymore. Attention drifts without effort, not toward anything specific, just away from the need to track change. Moments no longer line up in sequence. They don't lead anywhere. They simply appear, then remain as they are. The room seems to recognize this state. It settles further into itself, as if relieved of the responsibility to respond. Even the light feels quieter somehow, not dimmer, just less involved. The boundary between inside and outside softens, not by opening further, but by losing its importance. There is no longer a sense of waiting. Nothing is about to happen. Nothing has just finished happening either. The night has found its pace, and it isn't moving forward. It holds. And in that holding, details begin to lose their edges, not disappearing, but no longer insisting on being understood. This is where the world stays closed, without sealing anything off. From here on, things do not need to connect. There are places in the room where things were repaired once and never revisited. A thin line in the tile near the balcony marks where a crack used to widen each winter. It was sealed years ago, not carefully, just enough. The repair didn't restore the surface. It changed it, left behind a slight ridge that catches light differently than the rest of the floor. No one notices it while walking, only when standing still. Some fixes are like that. They stop something from getting worse without returning it to what it was before. The room contains several of them. A loose hinge that closes softly if the door is guided the right way. A drawer that opens farther than it should, then resists being pushed back in. These are not problems anymore. They've adjusted into the background. There was a time when they might have been addressed again. That time passed quietly. The balcony railing has a spot where the paint thinned unevenly. The metal beneath shows through in a dull, unreflective strip. It doesn't rust further. It doesn't improve either. The cold air settles there first, resting against the exposed surface, as if it recognizes something familiar. It's difficult to remember when these things were last considered temporary. At some point, they simply became part of how the space works. Attention doesn't linger on them anymore. It passes over, acknowledging without evaluating. There's a pause in the thought here, not intentional. Just a moment where the idea doesn't continue. The night doesn't mind. The room doesn't correct the pause. It allows it to stay unfinished. Imperfect fixes don't ask to be revisited. They hold because they can. The air moves through the open door again, touching the edge of the floor, the railing, the repaired places that no longer stand out. Nothing leads forward from here. The details remain, but they no longer connect to a larger shape. They exist without requiring resolution, and the room accepts that arrangement without comment. Some things remain in a place long enough that they stop feeling temporary. They don't announce when the shift happens. There's no clear moment to point to. One day, they simply belong. The chair by the door has been there through several versions of the room. It has been moved slightly, turned, used for other purposes, then returned close to where it started. Its legs no longer sit evenly on the floor. They adapted to the surface beneath them. Now the floor adjusts instead. The jacket on the back of the chair is not new, but it isn't old enough to be considered worn out either. It carries a shape that doesn't quite belong to it anymore. There are faint creases at the elbows, marks where hands were slid into pockets without thinking. The fabric has learned those movements. It holds them, even when the jacket is empty. Time behaves similarly in the room. It gathers in certain places and thins out in others. Near the balcony, it feels stretched, longer, less interested in counting itself. Near the interior walls, it feels more compact, as if it folded inward over the years. Some objects seem to carry more of it than others. A small scratch on the table surface was once sharp enough to catch a fingernail. Now it has softened, rounded by repeated contact. It no longer interrupts touch. It blends. There's a moment here where memory almost tries to explain something. It doesn't quite succeed. The room doesn't press for clarity. It lets the thought drift off before it finishes forming. The open air continues its slow movement. It doesn't bring anything specific with it. It doesn't remove anything either. It passes through the way it always has, regardless of what stayed behind. Things that remain long enough stop asking what comes next. They exist in a state that doesn't depend on progress. The room holds them all without organizing them into a story. They don't need one. They have already stayed. Attention no longer settles on any one thing. It moves, then forgets why it moved. The room remains present, but its edges feel less defined. Objects are still where they were, yet they don't hold focus the way they did before. The chair is still near the door. The jacket still hangs there, but the mind does not return to them. Instead, awareness drifts between spaces, between the chair and the table. between the table and the open air, between inside and whatever extends beyond the balcony. There is no clear reason for the movement. It isn't searching. It isn't avoiding anything either. The open space outside feels larger now, not because it expanded, but because nothing is measuring it. Wind moves through again, then pauses, then moves differently. The rhythm is no longer noticeable. It blends into the background without asking to be followed. Details begin to arrive without context. A faint shift in temperature, the sensation of fabric against skin, a sound that might be distant machinery or might not be sound at all. There is a moment where attention almost tries to name what it notices. It doesn't complete the task. The effort dissolves before finishing. The room does not require interpretation. It allows presence without labeling. Time loses its direction, not slowing, not speeding up, just losing the need to be tracked. Moments stop lining up behind one another. They appear, overlap, then remain without sequence. The boundary between thought and sensation softens. Neither one leads, neither one follows. The night holds this state easily. It doesn't demand coherence. The balcony light still glows somewhere in the periphery. It no longer feels central. It simply exists. Cold air continues to pass through the space, touching, then moving on, without leaving anything behind. Attention drifts again, not forward, not back, just open. This is not absence. It is the loosening of direction. From here, things will begin to arrive without needing to be placed. A sense of space without edges, cold, then not, movement that doesn't travel. Light continuing without purpose, air finding its way through, no effort. A pause that holds, nothing forming. The idea of distance without direction, the feeling of standing without weight. Time no longer placed. No before, no after. Stillness that does not need filling. Cold along the fingers, air moving, then stopping, the faint pressure of standing still, light without a source in view, a soft sound that doesn't repeat, the feeling of fabric where it folds, distance, a shift in temperature near the floor, the pause after a sound ends, the edge of awareness, something metallic, far away. Stillness that isn't empty. Breath moving without effort, the open space holding its shape, a line of light fading slightly, the sense of weight settling. Cold again, noticed differently this time, air passing through the room without touching anything, a moment without thought. The quiet between movements, the space where sound could appear, nothing arriving. A sense of space without edges, cold, then not, movement that doesn't travel. Light continuing without purpose, air finding its way through, no effort. A pause that holds, nothing forming. The idea of distance without direction, the feeling of standing without weight. no longer placed. No before, no after. Stillness that does not need filling. There is a moment, sometime, when nothing is required to change. Not because everything is resolved, but because continuing to hold things as they are feels sufficient. The room exists in that way now, not waiting, not concluding, just present. It's possible to notice how rarely anyone stops in a place like this. Where the day has already finished asking for attention, and the night hasn't begun asking for anything yet. In between, there is a stretch of time that doesn't belong to progress. It doesn't collect outcome. It doesn't store meaning carefully. It simply allows things to remain without deciding what they represent. Somewhere in that quiet space, a thought passes through without forming into language. Not a question exactly, more like a gentle outline of one. Something about how long things are allowed to stay before they're expected to move on. It doesn't demand an answer. It doesn't even wait. The thought drifts the way the air does, touching the edges of awareness, then moving past. Nothing needs to be understood for it to leave. The night doesn't pause to see if it was noticed. The room continues holding its shape. The cold air still passes through. The light remains on somewhere behind the attention. Whatever that thought might have been, it has done what it needed to do. It passed through. The wind becomes more noticeable without growing louder. It moves through the open balcony in slow intervals, sometimes present, sometimes absent, without explanation. The room doesn't follow its rhythm. It allows the movement to pass without adjusting. Cold air settles, then shifts again, finding places that were already open to it. The light on the balcony remains unchanged. It no longer feels like a choice. It feels like part of the structure of the night. Inside, surfaces respond quietly. Metal cools first, tile follows. fabric holds on to warmth a little longer before letting it go. The wind passes over these differences without pausing. It doesn't search for balance. It doesn't correct anything. The open space beyond the railing feels wider now, not because it expanded, but because nothing inside the room is measuring it anymore. Sound has thinned. What remains is distant enough to feel optional. There are longer stretches where nothing arrives. The wind fills those stretches not with sound, but with presence. The apartment holds steady. Its shape remains intact even as attention loosens its grip. The sense of being in the room softens. It becomes less about position and more about continuity. The cold no longer announces itself. It simply exists alongside everything else. The night feels settled into a version of itself that won't change much until morning. There is no need to observe closely now. The environment has taken over what observation used to do. The wind moves through the space again, lightly, then leaves it exactly as it was. The wind continues. It no longer feels like something passing through. It feels established. The open balcony holds its position. The night accepts it. Cold air moves across the floor, then lingers, as if it has found a place that does not resist it. The room remains steady. There is less to say now. The light outside still glows, but it no longer draws attention. It exists somewhere behind awareness. The space between sounds stretches. What remains of the city stays far enough away to feel abstract. Wind moves again, then not. The apartment does not mark time anymore. Moments pass without leaving edges. Attention no longer gathers. It spreads thin and stays that way. The cold it no longer knew. It blends with everything else. The room has stopped responding because nothing is asking it to. Wind across the railing. A shift in pressure. Then stillness. The voice does not return to explain this. There is nothing to clarify. The environment holds.